The moment he stepped into the velvet room, the air shifted at once, as if the very molecules in the room quietly rearranged themselves around his presence, like subjects bowing before a king without a crown. No one dared look at him directly, yet every pair of eyes lingered on him from the corners of their vision, afraid that being caught staring at power made flesh would mean they would have to answer for it. Claire sensed it immediately from behind the bar. Her dark brown hair was tied neatly back, and her hand froze for the briefest second over the glass she was polishing. 3 years of working in this underground bar hidden beneath the French Quarter had trained her to read a room faster than most people could read a single page of a book. And tonight, something was deeply wrong. Heavy notes from a saxophone seeped through the thick haze of cigarette smoke, merging with the red lights that washed over the worn brick walls, creating a scene that felt both dreamlike and unbearably tense. Claire glanced at the liquor shelf behind her, using the reflection to sweep across the room without turning her head, a survival skill she had learned after hundreds of nights on this job. In the corner near the emergency exit sat 3 men who were unnaturally still. Their eyes did not carry the usual curiosity reserved for powerful figures. It was the gaze of predators, unblinking, locked on Julian Hart, the man who had just entered and taken his usual seat at the bar. They wore long coats buttoned up tight even though outside was a stifling summer night. Their hands were hidden under the table. Their posture was far too perfect for anyone who had nothing to hide. Claire walked over and poured a glass of fine bourbon without asking, without needing a signal. She had served Julian long enough to know that every movement had to be precise, every word unnecessary. She set the drink in front of him, the overhead light refracting through the amber liquid, the ice shifting with a faint crackle. Julian did not look at her. He never did. To him, Claire was merely another functional piece of the room, useful but invisible. But tonight Claire understood she could not stay silent. Whatever happened next, she had to break that invisible line between them. Leaning forward as if wiping away a non-existent watermark on the counter, she lowered her voice until it was barely a breath, too soft for anyone else to hear. "They are watching you from the corner table. Do not look at me." Her heart pounded against her ribs like a war drum, but her hand stayed steady, sharp, disciplined, the most valuable skill of a bartender. Julian did not turn, did not change expression, but his index finger tapped the rim of his glass once, a gesture small enough to be mistaken for nothing, yet unmistakable to her. He had received the message. His eyes remained fixed on the surface of the bourbon as if reading a prophecy in its stillness. Not a muscle in his face shifted. Not a single movement betrayed the current running beneath his calm, a discipline carved from years spent facing danger and betrayal. Time dripped slowly, thick as honey sliding from the edge of a spoon, sweet and heavy with foreboding. Claire continued serving other customers with the same practiced smile, but her attention never left the 3 men guarding Julian with their silent vigilance. Hunters dressed as ordinary men. If you are listening at the moment everything balances on the edge of a single falling glass, when the smallest misstep could shift the path of death and open the possibility of survival, then you can already feel that this story is only beginning. Before we step deeper into the world where Claire has just crossed the most dangerous boundary of her life without even meaning to, make sure you subscribe to our channel, like and share so you won't miss a single breath-stealing moment in the chapters ahead, and tell us where you are listening from. Leave the name of your city or your country in the comments below. Every comment is a footprint that shows how far this story has traveled, and which hearts around the world are walking this journey beside you. Julian lifted his glass with an effortless motion, taking a small sip as if savoring the taste, rather than swallowing a message that could determine whether he lived or died. Claire stepped away from him, continuing her path around the bar as if nothing were happening, her hands moving quickly over bottles and shakers, her eyes gliding across faces, while her mind stretched tight like a drawn string. One of the 3 men in the corner began to move. He tilted his head toward the man beside him for a brief exchange, then stood up. His movements were crafted to appear casual, but Claire had seen that kind of step far too many times. He was positioning himself. The second man rose moments later and headed toward the entrance. The third, the most dangerous of the 3, walked toward Julian with unsettling calm, his gaze sweeping the room as though merely searching for a new seat. Claire tightened her grip on the bar towel, then suddenly let a glass slip from her hand. The shattering sound cracked through the room, piercing the thick, taut silence like a needle popping a balloon. Every head turned toward her. In that exact stolen moment, Julian rose from his stool and walked toward the hallway that led to the back of the bar, where a narrow service door opened into the alley beyond. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. Claire crouched to gather the fragments, her pulse pounding so hard it felt as though it might break through her chest. She heard the door close behind him, quiet and swift, and executed with perfect precision. A few seconds later, a low sound threaded through the lingering jazz, soft enough to be dismissed by anyone who did not know danger the way she did. A small, contained pop, the unmistakable voice of a silenced gun. The three men transformed at once. No more disguises. They lunged toward the back hallway, moving like shadows unhooked from the walls. Claire rose to her feet, wiping the spilled bourbon from the counter as if nothing had happened, though cold sweat coated her palms. Minutes later, the three men returned with clenched jaws and the weight of failure dragging behind their steps. Their eyes swept the bar, pausing on Claire longer than necessary. A chill shot down her spine. They were not sure she was involved, but they suspected enough to remember her. One of them tilted his head slightly, as if making a mental note. Then all three walked out into the thick New Orleans night, swallowed by secrets and darkness. Claire worked straight through until closing, every muscle taut as a bowstring. She did not know whether she had just saved a monster or a man carrying the scars of power, but she knew one truth with absolute clarity. The boundary she had spent years maintaining between herself and men like Julian Hart had been erased forever. And though fear curled in her chest, she also understood there was no turning back now. 3 nights passed after the evening when the glass shattered and Julian Hart vanished into the mist behind the velvet room, and everything seemed to return to normal in a way so eerily artificial it made Claire's skin tighten. She worked as she always did, serving drinks, mixing cocktails, offering polite smiles to familiar men, quiet women, and the nameless figures who never spoke their true identities. Yet inside her, every second felt like a shard of glass lodged beneath her ribs. The sensation of being watched clung to her like the darkness in a windowless wine cellar. And although she never saw the 3 men from that night again, the way certain customers glanced at her when they walked through the door, or how a black car lingered across the street longer than any car should, made it impossible to take a full breath. On the 4th night, when she arrived for her shift at 6 o'clock, Claire found a pale gray envelope lying neatly beneath the counter where she usually kept her polishing cloth. Her name, Claire Donovan, was handwritten across the front in a steady, slightly slanted script, the kind that belonged to someone who had once studied calligraphy in academies she had only ever seen in films. Her heart thudded violently as she opened it. Inside was a silver ring, thin but solid, its face engraved with a serpent coiled around itself, its head touching its tail like the symbol of eternity. There was also a folded slip of paper that held a single line of writing. "You did well. Never turn your back to the mirror. No signature, no name, no need." In the entire underworld of New Orleans, only one man marked his messages this way: Julian Hart. Claire curled her fingers around the ring, the cold metal pressing into her palm like a warning carved in ice. She did not know what frightened her more, being acknowledged by a man like Julian, or realizing that she had been noticed at all by forces that moved silently beneath the city's surface. In the world of men like him, attention meant the end of invisibility, and invisibility had been the only thing that kept her safe for 3 years. She slipped the ring into the pocket of her coat, her chest tightening with indecision. Part of her longed to toss it down a storm drain, to cut every thread of connection and pretend it had never happened. Yet another part of her, buried deeper and darker, whispered that this had been set in motion long before she ever understood it. The night drifted by under sorrowful jazz notes, thick cigarette smoke, and eyes that carried more words than mouths ever could. Claire worked with unusual focus, watching every movement, checking every reflection, using the mirror in the ice tray, the gleam of glass bottles, the curved shine of a metal spoon. She was beginning to understand she was no longer simply a bartender. She was living as someone who sensed eyes tracing her every step, and the truth was that this might very well be real. Just as the clock struck midnight, she found herself alone behind the bar, while the crowd thinned between musical sets. She slipped her hand into her pocket and brushed the ring with her fingertips. The dim red light from above caught the silver scales of the serpent and made them shimmer as if the creature were stirring. The message rose in her mind with stark clarity: never turn your back to the mirror. A tremor ran through her, not only because something unseen seemed to press against the edges of her awareness, but because the words carried another meaning entirely, not just a mirror, a reflection of herself. She had crossed a boundary, and once you see a different version of yourself staring back at you from the glass, you can never return to who you were before. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, When the last customers had finally drifted out, and Claire was gathering the dirty glasses to take to the sink, the door of the velvet room opened once more. There was no music, no heads turning. Yet Claire knew instantly that the person walking in was unlike anyone who had ever crossed this threshold before. The woman wore a fitted black dress, her posture straight, her steps so light it was as if her heels never truly touched the floor. Her dark brown hair was twisted into a low knot, her lips painted a red that resembled dried blood, and her gaze swept the entire room without missing a single detail despite lasting no more than a heartbeat. She took a seat at the bar near the entrance and nodded gently toward Claire, as if she already knew her. A familiarity that should not exist yet undeniably did. Claire approached, forcing her steps to remain steady and her breaths even, placing the bar towel on the counter to mask the tension in her hands. The woman ordered a martini, her voice carrying just enough volume, not too much, not too little. Claire prepared the drink in silence, feeling the prickle of the woman's attention on her like thin needles of cold metal. When the martini was placed on its coaster, the woman took a single sip, then reached into her small clutch and set a glossy black business card with silver edges on the bar. Julian Hart invites you to his private residence tomorrow evening. 7 sharp, formal attire. Bring nothing, except the ring he sent you. Her tone was soft, yet left no room for negotiation. Claire looked down at the card. Embossed letters read, Hart International Holdings. Beneath it was an address in the Garden District, one of the wealthiest corners of New Orleans, a place of wrought iron gates and the hushed silence of power. There was no phone number, no email, only the company name and the destination. Claire lifted her eyes to ask a question, but the woman was already standing, leaving behind a nearly untouched martini and a few neatly arranged bills. When the door closed behind her, the air inside the bar seemed to drop a few degrees. Claire picked up the card, her fingers trembling slightly, even as she forced her expression to remain composed. She sensed Pike, the bar's manager, stepping up behind her. He did not ask anything. He simply cast a quick glance at the card and gave a small nod like someone who had witnessed far too much to be surprised anymore. "You just met Juliet," he murmured, his eyes narrowing the way they did whenever he mentioned names that were better left unspoken. "Julian's right hand. If she came in person, then either you're about to get very lucky or you're about to land in serious trouble. Maybe both." Claire said nothing. She did not ask who Juliet was or how Pike knew, because in a place like the Velvet Room, those were not questions one was allowed to speak aloud. She slipped the card into her pocket beside the ring she had carried since the previous night, the chill of the silver feeling as if it merged with the silent letters pressed into the card. An invitation, a command, another line she was about to cross, even though she knew the other side offered no path back. Claire washed her hands, turned off the kettle, switched off each small bulb behind the bar. The room sank back into its muted red haze, hovering like cigarette smoke, refusing to disperse. When she locked the door and stepped out into the night, her hand remained curled around the pocket of her coat where the ring and the invitation rested together, 2 pieces of a dangerous game that had only just begun. The mansion sat at the end of a quiet cobblestone road, flanked by ancient oaks, whose heavy branches stretched overhead like weary arms, embracing the darkness. And when the taxi stopped before the wrought iron gate that rose taller than any person, Claire could feel every beat of her heart vibrating through her chest. She wore a simple black dress, her hair neatly pinned up, her makeup understated yet careful enough not to seem out of place in a world where every detail was orchestrated. The moment she stepped out, the gate opened automatically without a greeting, without anyone in sight, only a wash of warm light spilling from the path within, illuminating each of her steps along the gravel walkway that led toward the vast house. The front door opened the instant she reached it, and a butler in a dark suit stood with his back perfectly straight, his eyes not meeting hers yet, his posture unmistakable. Not a servant, but a guardian of thresholds. "Miss Donovan, please come in. Mr. Hart is waiting for you in the library." His voice carried an Eastern European cadence, each word as crisp as the scrape of a blade along whetstone. Claire followed him down a thick, carpeted corridor bordered by oil paintings and lit by chandelier light that glittered overhead like jeweled traps from old fairy tales. Every step she took, leaving behind an imprint in a world that did not belong to her. When the library doors were opened, Julian stood with his back to the tall windows, the fading afternoon light casting his shadow across the dark wooden floor. He wore no jacket and no tie, yet nothing about him was uncomposed. When he turned, his gaze locked onto hers, deep and dim, and unwilling to let anyone hide behind even the smallest lie. "Thank you for coming," he said, dispensing with introductions and unnecessary questions. Claire entered, steadying herself on her heels, the silver ring resting on her middle finger like an unremovable seal. Julian gestured toward a velvet-covered chair across from his large desk, where a crystal decanter of amber liquor stood at the center. He poured 2 glasses and slid one toward her. Claire did not drink. "I do not know why I am here," she said evenly. "I only did what any person with eyes and a beating heart would do." Julian tilted his head slightly as though weighing the truth of her words. "Wrong. Most people choose silence. For safety. You did not choose safety. You chose action. And now you exist in the sight of men you should have left undisturbed." Claire said nothing. His words needed no confirmation. She had seen the black car parked in front of her boarding house 2 nights in a row. She had heard the unclear but undeniable footsteps behind her on her way to class. Julian slowly rotated the glass in his hand, his gaze never leaving her. "I have 2 offers. 1, you disappear. I will arrange a safe exit, with a new name, a new home, and every trace erased. 2, you stay. Work for me. Officially." Claire drew a quiet breath. It was not a simple choice, losing her identity or losing her safety, running forever, or stepping into a world whose limits she could not even begin to imagine. "Why me?" she asked. "I am not special." Julian smiled faintly. "Precisely because you believe that." He rose, walked toward her, and stopped just before her chair. "This world is not run by those who chase the light. It is run by those who can stand in the dark and still keep their eyes open." Claire looked at the untouched glass before her, then lifted her gaze to him. "If I refuse, you will still be protected," he said. "But not forever. And you will live with the question for the rest of your life of what might have happened if you had dared to step forward." She tightened her hand slightly, feeling the cool, smooth face of the ring beneath her fingertip. Claire said nothing, but she did not rise to leave. And in the world of Julian Hart, silence was an answer. Claire left Julian's mansion a little before 8 o'clock in the evening with no definitive answer, no agreement signed, only the haunting silence that had followed her from the library all the way to the moment the wrought iron gate closed behind her. She returned to her small rented room near the university, the place she had lived for 3 years, trying to steady her breathing, trying to convince herself she still had a choice. She believed that if she did not respond, if she stayed silent long enough, everything might pass like a summer night storm, fierce for a moment, and then quietly gone. But 36 hours later, her wristwatch vibrated just before dawn, accompanied by a message from an unfamiliar number. It contained a photograph of the small house in Baton Rouge, where her mother and younger brother still lived. The front door, the porch, even the old wooden chair where her mother liked to sit and read were captured clearly. No one appeared in the picture, but no one needed to. Beneath it was a single line, "We know them too." Claire felt her heart plunge into the hollow beneath her ribs. She shot upright in bed, grabbed her phone, and called home, but no one answered. She called again, then a 3rd time. Still silence. Every ring felt like a blade scraping across her nerves. She threw on a coat, rushed into the street, and caught the earliest ride toward Baton Rouge, her mind spinning through possibilities, each one darker than the last. But when she arrived, the house was still there, the door still closed, the curtains fluttering lightly in the wind. Nothing outwardly wrong, no strange noises. Her mother opened the door after the 3rd knock, surprised to see her daughter show up unannounced. They were safe, but Claire was not. She noticed a car parked a few houses away, black, tinted, a license plate she did not recognize. The man inside did not look at her, yet his stillness delivered a threat clearer than any spoken warning. They were watching. They had crossed the line. She was no longer a bystander. On the way back to New Orleans, Claire did not sleep. Her eyes stayed fixed on the bus window, her head resting on the glass, but her mind refusing to rest. She thought about her mother's hands, calloused from a lifetime of work. She thought about her younger brother, 17 years old, who loved playing guitar and dreamed of becoming a sound engineer. She thought about the fear they did not yet know was surrounding them. By the time the bus reached its final stop, the sky was already dark. Claire did not return to her rented room. She walked through downtown, turned into a narrow alley that led toward the Garden District, back to the place where Julian's gate had opened once before. She rang the bell, and this time she did not wait long. The butler appeared almost immediately, asked nothing, simply nodded and gestured for her to come inside. Julian stood waiting in the library, just as he had the last time, but tonight no glasses of liquor were poured. She stepped inside and did not sit. her eyes fixed on him. "I will work for you," she said, her voice low and steady like a stone dropped into a deep well. "But we will have conditions." Julian did not move. Only a faint shift in his gaze revealed that he was listening, as if watching to see where the newly opened door between them would lead. Claire felt the tips of her fingers grow cold. The silver ring was still there, like a promise, or a pact she could no longer refuse. Julian did not answer immediately. He walked slowly toward the bookshelf against the wall, the light from the ceiling lamp catching the straight bridge of his nose and the slight furrow in his brow, making it impossible for Claire to read what was unfolding behind that formidable silence. She was no longer sure whether she stood before a man or an entire system of power draped in human form, but she also knew that if she did not set her conditions now, she would be consumed by this world just as countless others had been before her. Julian turned back to her, arms folded, his gaze now sharpened with intention. "What do you want?" Claire kept her back straight, her voice steady and unwavering. "First, I continue my studies until I earn my master's degree. No interruptions for any reason." Julian gave a small nod, offering no objection. "Second, I keep my job at the Velvet Room. I need that cover, and I need to remain a normal person in the eyes of normal people." Julian moved closer to the desk, his fingertip brushing the polished wood surface. "That cover is no longer safe. After what happened, there will be people asking questions. Which is all the more reason I have to stay," Claire replied. "If I disappear, they will know I matter. If I stay, they will think I am irrelevant." Julian's mouth shifted, not quite a smile, more a restrained acknowledgement. "Continue." Claire drew a deep breath. "Third, I receive training. Real training. Not just observing or carrying messages. I want to know how to protect myself." Julian lifted his head, and this time he looked directly into her eyes. The mystery was gone from his gaze. What replaced it was an appraisal, the measured calculation of someone evaluating the worth of a stock before choosing to invest. A long silence stretched between them before he finally spoke. "Accepted. But with a condition." Claire raised a brow, waiting. "You move to housing provided by me, tonight. Your current apartment has been observed far too closely. We cannot allow further risk," she almost argued, but then the image returned of the unmarked black car near her mother's home, of the cold gaze of the man inside. She nodded. Julian sat, opened a drawer, and brought out a thick folder, placing it on the desk before her. "Inside is your employment contract, confidentiality guidelines, training schedule, and information about the unit assigned to your personal security." Claire did not touch the papers. "I am not signing anything tonight." Julian nodded again, as though he had anticipated this. "There is no need. We began protecting your mother and your brother this morning. All measures are already in place. This is no longer a theoretical agreement, Claire. You are already in the game." Claire did not look away from him. She understood that from the moment she stepped into the mansion for the second time, every condition she listed was merely symbolic. She had already chosen, not because she trusted Julian, but because she knew she could no longer stand outside a world that had already begun closing in on every corner of her life. She reached forward and took the folder. She did not open it. She did not ask questions. And in her eyes now, there was no trace of fear, only the clarity of someone who had just entered a pact whose cost could not yet be measured. The new apartment sat on the top floor of a renovated historic building in the Garden District, its exterior draped in climbing vines and wrought iron balconies that carried the unmistakable charm of the American South, and Claire was taken there in the middle of the night with no luggage, no notice, only a silver-gray car that had picked her up from behind the Velvet Room, its driver saying nothing except one quiet sentence as he stopped at the base of the stairs. "Welcome to your new life." Inside was a world entirely unlike the one she had known, with high ceilings, soundproof walls, bullet-resistant windows, and a security system that responded only to her fingerprint. The bedroom was neat and pristine, with white sheets as crisp as those in a luxury hotel, and the living room shelves were filled with books on psychology, politics, history, and the art of communication, all arranged as though she had been anticipated long before she arrived. A missing piece finally fitted into place. On the kitchen counter lay a folder prepared for her. Inside it, a detailed training schedule for the next 3 weeks that included hand-to-hand combat, handling short-range weapons, identifying threats in crowds, and responding to emergency scenarios. Claire read each line with the strange sensation that she was studying the routine of someone else, yet when she lifted her head, The reflection in the kitchen mirror told her otherwise. It was her, with eyes darkened from lack of sleep, shoulders that no longer carried softness, and a gaze that no longer looked away. She had changed, not loudly, but quietly, like water carving its way into stone. The next day she returned to her university classes as though she had never been absent, sitting in the third row of behavioral economics, taking careful notes, and occasionally answering Professor Walsh with a calm voice and an unreadable expression. No one in the room knew that the student who walked home from campus would immediately change clothes and spend 4 hours in a covert training facility on the outskirts of the city, learning how to manage a knife in a narrow hallway or escape from a locked car trunk. Claire lived between two worlds as if they had always existed in parallel. By day she was a promising graduate student, by evening a familiar bartender, and by night a silent trainee of a system that operated in darkness. The skills she once believed existed only in films became nightly drills, memorizing maps, identifying individuals by their gait, and learning not to react when being followed. Some nights she returned to the apartment with bruised shoulders, scraped hands, sweat soaking the back of her shirt, yet she still poured herself a small drink before sitting down to read as though everything were perfectly within control. Pike asked no questions when she returned to work at the Velvet Room. He merely glanced into her eyes during her first shift back and gave a small nod, as if acknowledging someone who had endured a storm without needing to recount it. Julian did not appear either, not a message, not a call, but Claire knew he was watching. His presence felt like a thin thread around her wrist, not tight but never loosening. And amid all these unnamed changes, what surprised Claire most was that she was no longer afraid. She lived in a world where every decision carried its own cost, and she had begun to learn how to accept the bill when it came without blinking. The first training session began at 5 o'clock in the morning, when fog still clung to the treetops behind the isolated facility, nearly an hour outside the city, and Claire was awakened by a single message from Juliet. 15 minutes. Be there. No delays. A dark, uniformed driver waited in an SUV beneath the building without saying a word during the entire ride. When they arrived, she was guided into a windowless concrete structure, and inside was a vast room lined with thickly padded wooden floors, white overhead lights casting an almost unreal glow across the space. Her trainer was a Latin American man of about 40, solidly built with eyes sharp as blades, who introduced himself briefly as Ramirez. No rank, no greeting, only a clipped command to begin and a sudden strike to her shoulder that nearly knocked her backward. She had not yet regained her balance when the second blow came from her side, followed by a sweeping kick that sent her crashing to the mat. Ramirez showed no sympathy. He pulled her back to her feet but denied her even a moment to breathe. You think the world waits for you to be ready? While you are thinking, someone else has already fired, he said, his voice as cold as winter stone. Claire offered no argument, only a nod as she moved into stance. The first day was hell, not because of pain but because of the raw humiliation of having every weakness laid bare. Each reflex was tested, each movement corrected, each breath disciplined. Ramirez did not simply teach her how to strike back. He forced her to understand the principle of survival. One does not endure by being stronger but by being faster, more alert, and ruthless at the exact moment required. After the first session, Claire collapsed onto the floor, sweat soaking her back, her hands trembling with exhaustion, her mouth so dry she could not form a word. But she did not quit. On the second day she returned, and on the third. By the end of the first week she could counter 3 consecutive attacks, and she even managed to take Ramirez down once, though he pinned her twice as hard immediately afterward in warning. She learned to read intention from the tilt of a shoulder, to use gravity rather than resist it, and to keep her mind calm when trapped from behind. Each session was a quiet war between her survival instincts and her own limits. Beyond hand-to-hand combat, she was trained with light and sound reflex drills, memorizing maps within 2 minutes before navigating blind in darkness and escaping confined spaces in under 1 minute. There was no mercy, no encouragement, but also no humiliation. Everything was silent, intense, and precise. Each session ended with 5 minutes of stillness. No phone, no music, only a white room with a single wooden chair. Ramirez called it a warrior's quiet. Claire sat there, sweat still trailing down her temples, her pulse not yet steady, but the panic that marked her first day was gone. She knew she was not yet strong enough, fast enough, or skilled enough, but she had conquered the most important thing: fear. And only after conquering that can a person begin to truly exist in a world where no one ever teaches you how to live. Every Wednesday evening at exactly 8 o'clock, Claire was driven by Juliet from the training compound back to Julian's mansion, with no clear schedule, no explanation, only a steady rhythm of meetings held in the quiet library, where warm, golden light touched the tall bookshelves, and the soft tick of a pendulum clock was the only sound filling the spaces between silences. There, Julian never spoke of weapons or combat. Instead, he set a large wooden chessboard on the low table, placed 2 glasses of liquor beside it, and motioned for her to sit. In the first game, Claire lost in 13 moves, not because she did not know the rules, but because she had never learned to consider how someone else might respond. Julian did not teach the way ordinary instructors did. He never pointed out right or wrong moves. He asked questions. Why choose the rook instead of keeping the bishop? You think if you make a good move, your opponent will leave you alone. When you defend too cautiously, what makes you believe the attacker will give up? They were not questions meant to instruct but to awaken. Claire quickly realized the chessboard was not a game at all. It was a perfect metaphor for the world she had stepped into, where every move was an ethical choice, every sacrificed pawn a conscious trade-off, and perhaps most important of all was knowing when to retreat, so you could return in a stronger position. After the 4th match, Julian stopped mid-game and pointed to her knight. Do you know why the horse always moves in an L shape? Claire looked down, puzzled. Because it never goes in a straight line. And in this game, the one who never walks straight is the one no one can predict. Claire looked up, seeing for the first time that Julian's gaze was not cold but probing, not testing her strategy but her nature. After each game, they often stayed in silence for long moments, sometimes drifting into brief conversations about the history of coups, about figures who had shaken nations not with weapons but with information. Claire began to understand that real power did not belong to the one who pulled the trigger, but to the one who could make another person believe they should. Power did not live in shouting but in the silence others respected. Once, after a move that forced Julian to retreat 2 pieces, he leaned back in his chair and gave the faintest smile. You are starting to play like someone who is not afraid to lose. That is the moment others begin to fear you. It was not a compliment. It was a warning. In this world, a calculating woman could be admired, but a woman with nothing left to lose became a threat. By the 4th week, Claire held her ground evenly. She did not win, but she was no longer being guided like in the earliest games. She learned to see the entire board rather than just individual pieces, learned that some things could not be protected forever, and that sometimes a sacrifice was the only way to turn the tide. She had not become someone like Julian, but she had begun to see the world through the same language. And in that language, every gesture, every silence, every glance exchanged in a room steeped in power was a move already calculated. Claire no longer sat at the table as an apprentice. She sat as a player, and that alone shifted the balance of everything. That morning began like any other, with a speed reflex drill inside a sealed room where sudden bursts of sirens and flashing lights forced the brain to work at its limit, distinguishing between signals to move and warnings to stay still, and Claire completed the test 10 seconds faster than the previous week. Ramirez gave a small nod, not praise, but his version of acknowledgement. She was gathering her things to leave when Juliet walked in without announcement or greeting, delivering a single clipped command: change clothes. Claire saw the outfit laid neatly on a chair: dark jeans, a leather jacket, soft-soled shoes, and a small earpiece nestled in a black velvet box, as if everything had been prepared long before she arrived. When she stepped out, Juliet was already waiting beside the car, her face carved as if from marble. They said nothing during the drive, and only when the vehicle turned into the service entrance of an old shopping complex long since closed did Juliet look at her. Her gaze no longer merely supervisory but measuring, as though weighing the value of a playing piece. The objective is surveillance, not intervention. If it becomes dangerous, withdraw. But if you want to stay in this game, this is the moment to prove it. Claire nodded. She asked no questions, requested no additional time. She knew that in the real world, no one received advance warning. The test was whatever unfolded beyond the boundaries of a plan. She placed the earpiece in her ear, stepped out of the car, and blended into the flow of people entering the coffee shop on the corner. Inside, the air was cold and filled with the smell of roasted beans. She chose a table near the window, sat with her back to the street like any ordinary customer, ordered a black coffee, and scanned the room through the glass's reflection. A man entered 3 minutes later, middle-aged, tall, close-cropped hair, sleeves rolled up on a white shirt, No bag. Everything about him fell within the range of normal except his eyes. They swept the room too evenly, as though he were marking targets rather than simply looking around. Claire lowered her gaze and stirred her coffee, the fingers of her left hand resting lightly on her bag, where an emergency signal device was tucked inside. She did not touch it. Instead, she opened her phone, activated the front camera, and pretended to fix her hair, the screen capturing the man clearly as he sat at a table behind her. He was speaking to someone through a wireless earpiece, and his eyes lingered on her one beat too long. A whisper sounded through her earpiece, Juliet's voice slipping into her consciousness like a thought she had not meant to think. "You've been identified. If you feel pressure, give the signal." But Claire did not signal. She shifted subtly, turned as if absent-minded, let her spoon fall to the floor, bent down, and in the instant she rose, her eyes met his. He jerked slightly, not much, but enough to reveal that he knew he had been noticed. He left soon after, not hurried, but quickly enough to show he was retreating. When Claire stepped out of the cafe, Juliet was waiting across the street, her gaze meeting Claire's for the first time with something unspoken, a quiet recognition. No one spoke during the ride back, but when they arrived, Juliet turned to her, her voice carrying something like a blessing buried beneath the frost. "You passed a test that has no score, not because you are clever, but because you knew how to keep yourself from being pulled in." Claire nodded, neither smiling nor proud. Inside her, every muscle was still drawn tight like a bowstring, but for the first time, she did not feel like someone running from danger. She felt like someone who knew how to exist within the game. Claire returned to the Velvet Room on a Friday night. Nothing unusual in the air except the faint sense that something had slipped out of orbit, and she had learned to recognize even the smallest disruptions, the irregular slowing of an old customer's breath, the silence stretched too long between two notes of music, the way the light from the overhead lamp landed on the corner table where no one should ever sit. Tonight, someone was sitting there. The man appeared during the jazz band's third song, drawing no attention, making no strange movements. He wore a dark suit with a deep navy tie, his hair cropped short, his face smooth to the point of being forgettable, and it was exactly that forgettable quality that put Claire instantly on alert. He ordered a Scotch neat, placing his hand on the bar in the precise spot where Julian usually set his glass. His eyes were neither probing nor eager, yet sharp as needles, and Claire knew, though she had never seen him before, that he was one of the dangers Julian had warned her about. "A peaceful evening," he said in an even voice that sounded almost warm, though there was no warmth in his gaze. Claire placed the Scotch before him, silent as she always was with unfamiliar customers. "I've heard a great deal about you, Claire Donovan." He spoke her name without asking, without introducing himself. Claire kept her breathing steady, her hands resting on the edge of the counter, her thumb pressing the tiny alarm device hidden beneath the wood. A faint pulse at her wrist confirmed the signal had been sent. "I'm afraid you've mistaken me for someone else," she replied evenly, not defensive but not friendly. "No, I haven't, and you know that." He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers, not for a heartbeat. "Julian Hart is an interesting man. You've caught his attention. That is rare. But sometimes attention from powerful men comes with a rather expensive price." Claire did not react. She knew every word she spoke now could be used against her, twisted into bait. But he did not need her reaction. He only needed to plant a seed. "I am not here to threaten you. I'm here to offer something." He reached into his jacket and set a black disposable phone on the counter, placing it gently as if laying down a card. "One number is already saved. All you have to do is call when you have information, anything related to Julian's port development project. Meeting schedules, documents, timelines, those sorts of things." Claire did not touch the phone, but her pulse quickened. He knew more than she had imagined. "What if I don't know anything?" she asked, her voice steady, sounding like a bartender dragged into a story that should not involve her. "You make excellent drinks," he said with a perfect smile that made her skin crawl. "But eventually Julian will bring files here, or take calls while drinking, or leave folders on the table. You won't need to steal, only observe and remember. That is within your ability." Claire stayed silent. He pushed the phone a little closer to her. "If you cooperate, everything stays quiet. You keep studying, working, living your life, and your family in Baton Rouge will never have to know there was someone standing outside their door at midnight." Claire felt her entire body go cold, a sheen of sweat forming at the back of her neck. "And if I refuse, I don't think you will. But if you do, I imagine there could be accidents, car crashes, house fires, who can say? He took another sip, then rose from his seat. You have 3 days. Don't be the good person. They're always the first to die. He left exactly as he had arrived, quietly, without haste, leaving behind nothing but the phone and the scent of danger hanging in the air. Claire picked up the glass he had drunk from and poured it straight down the sink. Her hand trembled, but her eyes stayed sharp. The game had just changed boards, and she was the piece caught between two hands no one could fully trust. The moment the bar closed, Claire triggered the second alarm device, and less than 5 minutes later, an armored SUV appeared at the back entrance of the Velvet Room with its headlights off and the engine humming softly. Claire climbed in without a word, her face drawn tight like a stretched string. Juliet was already inside, a tablet in her hands, her eyes sharpened as if freshly honed. Without asking, she already knew what had happened. Claire managed one steady breath before the screen lit up in front of her, showing Julian's face inside a control room filled with monitors and maps. She recounted every word Grayson had sent through his envoy, every detail, from the way the man sipped his scotch to the way he walked out, even the line, "Don't be the good person." Julian listened without interrupting. His expression never changed, but his eyes darkened, cold and precise, as though he were calculating the death of the man who had dared to threaten someone under his protection. When Claire finished, Juliet turned the tablet toward her, displaying images captured from hidden cameras inside the Velvet Room. The man's face, the license plate of the car he boarded after leaving, the signal ping from the disposable phone he left behind. Julian nodded slowly, his voice deep and steady like an order spoken by a commander in the middle of a war zone. He is Grayson's newest right hand, the one who handles covert operations and psychological pressure. The fact that he showed up in person instead of sending someone else means Grayson is raising the stakes, and I am ready to answer. Julian turned to Claire, his gaze direct and sharp, piercing through anything she might try to hide. You will be at the center of the countermeasure. What exactly does he want? Documents on the port expansion project, she answered, and Julian nodded as if that were the final puzzle piece he needed to complete a much larger plan. Then we will give him exactly what he wants, but on our terms. Juliet began assembling the operation right there in the car, an elaborate set of forged documents, complete with seals, detailed plans, even a security layout that looked vulnerable, but was designed to be the perfect trap. Claire would deliver these documents to the meeting point Grayson would choose, playing the role of someone coerced into cooperation, frightened but alert enough to survive. Can you do it? Julian asked as the car stopped outside the safe house mansion. Claire met his eyes head-on, seeing both worry and trust in them. If this ends the threat against my family, against the Velvet Room, against you, then I'll do it. But I have one condition. I want full remote surveillance, a support team ready to intervene. I will not die pointlessly while everyone watches through a screen. Julian smiled, a rare smile, and a genuine one. That's the answer I hoped for. You're not alone in this, Claire. The entire team will be around you, hidden in the dark. You just need to lead them exactly where we want them to go. Everything else is mine to handle. That night, Claire was fully outfitted. A microphone hidden inside her earring, a tracking device in the sole of her shoe, a watch with an emergency alert activated by a single touch. The forged documents were placed in a real leather handbag, complete with the scent of aged paper and fresh ink. To the untrained eye, there was no way to guess that every number on those pages was deadly bait. Claire checked her reflection in the mirror before getting into the car. In the fitted dress and heels, she looked like a woman desperate enough to bargain with the devil to save her life, but her eyes burned, the fire of someone who had tasted fear long enough to know she would not be cornered again. Juliet stepped in and handed her an old phone. One number is saved. It will ring at midnight. Grayson, or one of his men, will give the rendezvous point. From that moment, Phase 2 begins. Claire nodded, fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag. Every step from here would be a walk along the razor's edge between life and death. But this time, she was not walking alone. At 11 o'clock that night, Claire sat alone inside the auxiliary security room of the mansion, where the gentle light seemed engineered to keep a heartbeat from shattering under pressure. The screen before her displayed the layout of the abandoned seafood processing plant Grayson had chosen for the meeting, a place perfectly suited for exchanges no one was meant to witness, far from any residential area, dense with exits and blind corners, which only made it more dangerous. On the table lay the tiny earpiece that had been checked 3 times, the alert watch strapped to her wrist with its fresh battery, each item carrying the weight of life and death. Claire looked down and noticed her hands trembling, even though her mind refused to allow fear to take over. She had practiced shooting, practiced dodging, practiced staying calm in simulations of pursuit, but none of it had ever felt as real as tonight. This was not training. There would be no safety net. Juliet stepped inside and handed her a bottle of water, staying silent for the first 5 minutes. They had worked together long enough to know that silence itself was part of preparation. Then Juliet spoke, her voice lower than usual, as if afraid to rouse the sleeping beast inside Claire. Do not force yourself to be strong when fear is a natural response. But do not let fear paralyze your mind. If you feel yourself losing control, return to what we practiced. Analyze, break things down, act one step at a time. Claire nodded and drank, unaware of how dry her throat had become. Juliet reached into her pocket and handed her a mint candy, the way Claire's mother used to do when she was a child afraid of the dark. The cool sweetness soothed the harsh dryness at the back of her throat and reminded her who she was, where she came from. She was not a warrior born into this world. She was a bartender, an art history student, someone who once believed that the world was run by officials and laws. Now she knew that behind the headlines and documents were meetings like tonight, nameless exchanges, people making decisions with guns, money, and silence. She drew a deep breath and reminded herself that she was no longer the fragile Claire who once feared unfamiliar footsteps in the night. She was the Claire who had survived sleepless nights worrying about her mother, the Claire who had seen Julian's eyes turn toward her with acknowledgement for the first time, the Claire Grayson had no idea he was about to face. At 11:30 she changed clothes. The dark outfit fit snugly, designed to look as ordinary as possible while still allowing swift movement. Her hair was tied back, her makeup minimal, every detail chosen to make her difficult to identify on security cameras. Julian arrived at 11:45, saying nothing at first, standing in the doorway and watching her like a man assessing the final move of an impending chess match. "You have nothing to prove to anyone. You only need to survive," he said, his voice low and resonant like something rising from beneath the earth. Claire turned to him. "I do not want to survive. I want to end this." Julian nodded slowly, as if recognizing that the pawn no longer wished to remain a pawn. "You will do it, not because of your training, but because you chose not to bow." He placed a hand on her shoulder, warm and heavy like an unspoken vow. As they stepped toward the car, the night outside felt colder than expected, and the wind sweeping in from the lake carried a salty edge like the taste of blood. The SUV rolled forward in silence, Claire in the back seat with both hands gripping the handbag that held the forged documents. Every jolt of the vehicle made her thoughts churn harder. She did not know exactly what awaited her on the other side of that meeting, but she knew one thing with certainty. After tonight, either Grayson would lose his ability to threaten anyone, or she would forever lose the ordinary life she once had. And in her heart, there was no fear left. Only a single choice remained: to walk into the tiger's den with the posture of someone who already knew the location of every hidden fang. Claire stepped out of the car at a spot roughly 300 meters from the meeting point, close enough to keep every signal on her body working perfectly, yet far enough to avoid suspicion if an ambush was waiting. The air was cold enough to sting, and the wind scraped against rusted metal sheets, making them cry out like warnings rising straight from the dark. The streetlights in this part of town had died long ago, leaving only the faint glow of handheld flashlights carried by 3 men waiting outside the warehouse entrance. One of them moved forward, dressed in a long black coat, his face revealed beneath the weak light, the same man who had come to Velvet Room that night. No greeting, no courtesy, just a hand extended toward Claire like a programmed machine. She gave a slight nod, steadying her breath as she placed the handbag into his grasp, without letting her fingers tremble. He opened it, examining each forged document Julian and Juliet had crafted with such precision. The dock expansion plans, the cargo transport routes, the personnel lists full of names that did not exist. He nodded, exchanged a glance with the man behind him, then spoke in a calm voice, lined with unmistakable satisfaction. "Mr. Grayson will appreciate your timely cooperation." Claire said nothing. She simply held his gaze, her eyes free of fear or challenge, filled only with the clarity of someone who knew exactly what waited behind the steel door. He signaled, and the other 2 men stepped forward, taking her by the arms, not roughly, but firmly enough to erase any illusion of choice. She was escorted inside the warehouse, where dim bulbs cast weak, uneven shadows across stained concrete. The air smelled of dampness and old machine oil, thick like something that had never moved in years. Each footstep echoed through the empty space as if rising from the bottom of a deep pit. They said nothing. Claire did not ask. She understood this was the hardest part, staying calm when every instinct inside her screamed danger. In her ear, Juliet's voice drifted through the tiny hidden earpiece like a breath against her skin. All teams are in position. Minimal communication. Keep moving until the next signal. Claire closed her eyes for a single heartbeat, pushing back the pounding in her chest. When she opened them, she had become the woman they expected to see, frightened but not broken, compliant but not collapsing. A large door opened at the back of the warehouse, and she was guided into the rear compartment of a tarp-covered truck. There was nothing inside except a narrow bench and two faint red lights glowing like half-hearted embers. She sat, body still, eyes scanning the cramped space for anything she might use if the situation turned. The door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed everything, and Claire was carried off into a moving void, silent as a nightmare that refused to speak. She did not know where they were taking her, only that every movement had already been calculated. All she had to do was wait for the next signal. Wind seeped through a small gap in the door, creating a thin, whistling sound, the only noise inside the truck. She closed her eyes again, not out of fear this time, but to focus. The game had reached its decisive moment, and she, once merely a pawn, now sat at the center of the board, holding the one card Grayson never imagined she carried. The truck stopped after roughly 20 minutes of driving. Long enough to disorient Claire, yet short enough for her to know the destination remained within Julian's reach of control. A voice from the front cabin, firm and emotionless, ordered the doors opened. Headlights flared into her eyes, forcing her to squint, but within seconds she realized she had been taken to another warehouse, larger, arranged as if someone had prepared it in advance. Inside, 3 armed men were already in position, each stationed in a strategic corner. She was brought to the center of the warehouse, where an old wooden table stood alone, and on it lay the stack of documents taken from her moments earlier. A man sat behind the table, his back turned to her, and only when he spoke did she recognize Grayson's voice. "You are quicker than I thought, Claire." He turned around, his face lit fully beneath the harsh bulbs. It was the first time she saw him in the flesh, no longer just a shadow of power behind threats whispered through others. A middle-aged man with eyes cold as tempered steel, and a smile that never touched the depths of his gaze. He motioned for someone beside him to hand the documents back. "Are you certain about the accuracy of what you brought me?" he asked while his eyes skimmed through each page with practiced efficiency. Claire nodded, keeping the carefully trained unease in her expression. He studied her, as though dissecting her soul through every tiny flicker of her face. But before he could speak again, the lights flickered 3 times in rapid succession, a signal that did not belong to his system. Grayson snapped his head toward the ceiling, eyes turning instantly to ice, and in the same heartbeat, explosions cracked from outside the warehouse. Not one but many, followed by the shatter of glass, the clash of metal, and shouts rolling like thunder. One of Grayson's men raised his hand to his radio, but before a single word slipped out, he dropped to the floor as a tranquilizing round pierced his neck. Claire dove toward a nearby shelving unit and rolled across the concrete, just as she had been trained. The main doors burst open and shadows poured in, each one of Julian's operatives moving like a silent weapon. They advanced as a single organism, each step calculated, each breath measured. Not a single lethal bullet was fired. Everything was tranquilizers, rubber rounds, electric charges designed to take prisoners, not lives. Juliet's voice came through Claire's earpiece, clear and steady as a scalpel. Team 1, advancing from 3 o'clock. Team 2, securing the back entrance. Confirm Grayson's position. He is retreating toward the east room. Claire rose and sprinted down the hallway at the far end, knowing exactly where he would run. She found him fighting with a heavy steel door, sweat streaking his face, his hand trembling though the gun in it was clamped tight. When he turned, Claire was already there, her eyes fixed on him with a calm that spoke louder than any weapon. She did not need to raise a hand. The look alone told him the game was over. He lifted the gun, but in the same second, 2 red laser dots landed on his chest. A razor-sharp command echoed through her earpiece. "Do not." He knew then he was surrounded. His fingers eased open, the gun clattering softly against the floor, though defiance still burned in his eyes. Julian appeared a breath later, not loud, not dramatic, and with a single nod his team surged in, securing the last of Grayson's men. Claire stood still, watching as Grayson was handcuffed and escorted toward an armored vehicle. No one spoke. There was no need. The game had ended, and the pawn everyone dismissed had placed the final decisive move. Grayson was shoved into the back seat of the armored SUV, his wrists bound tightly behind him, his head bowed like a man who had finally lost everything. The smirk was gone. The condescending stare that once made others tremble had vanished, leaving only an empty gaze and the silent resignation of a cornered animal. Claire stood outside the warehouse, the night wind brushing through her hair, the faint scent of gunpowder still hanging in the air. She exhaled a long breath without realizing how long she had been holding it. Julian stood a few steps away, hands in his coat pockets, his eyes following the vehicle as it rolled out of the yard, carrying away the man who had posed the greatest threat to both of them. "Federal agents will take him into custody in the morning," Julian said without turning toward her. "With all the documents and evidence recovered tonight, he will have no escape." Claire nodded, her gaze still fixed on the SUV disappearing behind the iron fence. Yet what captured her attention even more were the faces of Julian's team. No one looked triumphant or satisfied. There was only focus as they checked their gear, swept the area, and secured every corner. It was as if this was merely one operation among hundreds. But for Claire, this was the end of a long chapter, a life and death match she had once doubted she could survive. Juliet approached from the left, handing her a towel and a bottle of water. She said nothing, simply met Claire's eyes with a look that, for the first time, was not entirely cold. Claire took the water, drank a small sip, and wiped her face with the chilled towel. Only then did she notice the grime and sweat covering her skin, while her mind slowly settled into clarity. Memories of the night came back in slow motion. The red lights, the pounding footsteps, the gun pointed at her, the twin lasers, the order to hold fire, and now, the quiet. Julian stepped closer, his voice low but gentler than usual. "You did better than expected, not because everything went according to plan, but because you held your ground to the very end." Claire turned to him, something both steady and fragile shining in her eyes. "I do not know if it was courage or simply having no way out." Julian tilted his head slightly, his gaze deep, as though searching her thoughts. "Whatever it was, it saved you. And it saved me." He paused, then added, "From now on, we will not let anyone push you into a corner like that again." Claire did not answer, but her eyes softened, the hard shell she had built over countless tense days finally easing. She knew this was not a full ending. Men like Grayson never acted alone. The network behind him still existed, a web whose center had yet to be touched. But at least, tonight, they had severed one of the monster's limbs. "Let's go," Julian murmured, extending his hand almost instinctively. Claire looked at it for a single heartbeat, then took it. His hand was warm, steady, a promise wrapped in silence. As they walked away from the warehouse, the sky to the east was beginning to pale. The first threads of dawn slipped through the rusted metal sheets and spilled across the dusty ground, a gentle sign that a new chapter had begun after a night that had refused to end. The small seaside house in Biloxi held the same fragile peace it had on the day Claire first returned to her family after fleeing the life she once knew. The late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the white fence and settling on the wooden porch where her mother sat, with her hands resting gently in her lap, her eyes fixed on the narrow road leading to the house. She did not cry, did not smile, simply waited in a silence that felt as though it had lasted for hours, waiting for this very moment. Claire slowed her steps, each footfall heavy with everything she could not say. Her younger brother, Ethan, opened the door after hearing the car, his face marked by the confusion of someone thrust into a game without ever being told the rules. When Claire stepped closer, her mother rose. There was anger in her eyes, worry too, but more than anything, there was a sorrow so deep it could not be shaped into words. They did not ask questions, did not embrace, did not demand explanations. They simply let Claire walk inside as though she were a daughter returning from a long trip instead of a woman fleeing danger. Dinner had already been prepared, simple dishes arranged with the quiet intention of offering whatever comfort they could. The three of them sat around the old wooden table, the round ceiling lamp swaying slightly with the breeze, its soft yellow glow touching their faces as if trying to soften the lines carved by fear and waiting. Ethan was the first to break the silence, his voice small and tentative. "Claire, what happened? They told us someone was trying to hurt you. Mom has not slept for 3 nights. Claire tightened her grip around the glass in her hands, the coolness of the water anchoring her thoughts before they spiraled out of control. "I cannot tell you everything, Ethan. Not because I do not trust you, but because knowing more would put all of you in even greater danger. What matters is that you are safe now. Her mother's voice came next, rough with emotion held far too long. But what are you doing, Claire? Who is protecting you? I spent my whole life avoiding trouble so you and your brother could grow up in peace. And now you are the reason we are on the run. Claire lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. I never meant to drag the family into this. I thought I could manage it, keep my distance, live 2 separate lives without hurting anyone. But things went further than I expected. I saw what real danger is, and I know I can never go back to the way things were. Ethan stared at her, a mixture of fear and admiration in his eyes. So, you are working for someone? That man? Julian? Claire stayed silent for a few seconds before giving a small nod. He is the one who saved me more than once, the one who gave me choices when I believed I had nothing left but fear. Her mother sighed, her fingers lacing together tightly on the table. I do not need to know the details. I only need to know one thing, that you are not becoming like the people you are fighting against. Claire lifted her head, a clear, steady light rising in her eyes. No, Mom, I will not. If there is one thing I have learned from all of this, it is that no one survives for long if they lose who they are. No matter where I am or what I do, I am still your daughter, Ethan's sister, someone who will do anything to protect what she loves. The air in the kitchen slowly eased, the tension unraveling like a tightened string finally released. Dinner continued, this time slower, fuller, softer. Afterward, as Claire helped her mother wash the dishes, the older woman placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. If you cannot come back, at least let me know you are alive. A message, a sign. Will you do that? Claire turned and wrapped her arms around her mother, tears slipping silently onto her shoulder. I promise, no matter what happens, I will never leave you waiting in silence again. Outside, night settled over the shoreline. But this time, the darkness no longer felt threatening, because inside Claire, the light of her family had become a guide she would always carry home. When Claire returned to the secluded estate hidden in the western outskirts of New Orleans, the sky had already turned the deep amber of late afternoon. The trees murmured in the wind, insects buzzed in the hush of approaching evening, yet there was no peace inside her. After seeing her family, she knew with painful clarity that she was no longer someone standing on the outside of danger looking in. She stepped into Julian's study just as the heavy wooden door was opened by a security aide. He stood with his back to her, hands resting on the leather chair, the light from the tall window behind him stretching his shadow across the polished floor. Claire waited without speaking. She did not need to announce herself, he already knew she was there. Julian turned, and the icy sharpness of his gaze softened slightly when it met hers. How long were you gone? 1.5 days, she answered, her voice soft but steady. Is everything all right? They are safe, but still worried. And perhaps they always will be. Julian nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. He was quiet for a moment, as though weighing each word before releasing it. We have come very far from the day you told me you were only a bartender with good observational skills. Claire smiled faintly but said nothing. Julian stepped to the desk, pulled out a thin folder, and laid it before her. This is the official contract, a special advisor position within my organization, full authority to investigate potential threats in the social sphere, where expensive suits and sweet lies often hide the stains of blood. You will have access to all data, maximum protection, and complete freedom in how you carry out your assignments. Claire stared at the papers, a complicated tide of emotion rising in her chest. It was not the title that struck her, nor the privileges it carried, but the trust behind the offer, quiet, absolute, and heavy. I thought you already had Juliet for that, she said softly. Julian eased into his leather chair, leaning back with a calmness that carried its own weight. Juliet is the strategist, the one who sees the entire board. You are the one who steps into the room, who notices what others miss. You are not replacing anyone. You are what this organization has been missing. Claire lowered her gaze to the empty space on the desk. Part of her wanted to refuse. Accepting meant burying her old life completely. But another part, the part that had stepped into danger out of instinct and survived, knew she could never return to being invisible. If I agree, do I get to set my own terms? Julian tilted his head slightly. Tell me. I want to keep working at Velvet Room. Not only for the cover. It was the first place I sensed danger, but also the place I learned how to survive. And I want to continue attending university, even if it is slow. Julian nodded without hesitation. What else? Claire drew a deep breath. I want further training. Not only physical, strategy, psychology, negotiation, everything. Grayson used to manipulate an entire city for years. Julian said nothing at first. Then he rose, walked toward her, and stopped just a breath away. That is not a request. That has been my plan from the beginning. You think I invested in you only to send you against men like him without giving you every tool you need? Claire looked up at him, and for the first time, she felt a balance between them. No longer a protected asset or a debt owed. A partner, an ally. She nodded, slow but certain. Then let us start from the beginning. Julian extended his hand, and this time, when she took it, it was not a handshake for survival, but an agreement between two people who understood the cost of power and the cost of freedom. On the desk, the lamplight glinted across the words on the contract cover. Claire Donovan, Senior Advisor, Office of Strategy and Risk. A new chapter had just been written by her own choice. Velvet Room was still bathed in its deep red glow, jazz drifting lazily through a veil of cigarette smoke and the quiet clink of crystal. Yet tonight everything carried a different weight. Claire stood behind the bar, her hand moving across the familiar wooden counter, as though touching a memory. Only this time she was no longer the silent bartender orbiting the edges of power. Her name had been etched onto ownership papers. The contract had been signed, and the right to decide now belonged to her. Pike, who had worked this place for nearly 3 decades, sat at his usual table near the back, raising his glass while his eyes followed her, the way a father watches a daughter step into adulthood for the first time. When she approached, he handed her an envelope. Inside were the bar's ledgers, the key to the safe, and a small handwritten note in his firm, careful script. Velvet Room listens more than it speaks. Guard that silence. It has saved my life more than once. Claire said nothing, only bowed her head in gratitude. Pike rose, placed a hand on her shoulder, and left without looking back. He did not need to. He knew she understood. No one else in the bar knew about the transition. They simply watched Claire take over as though the place had always belonged to her. No one questioned the way she rearranged the seating, added mirrored panels behind the liquor shelves, or installed miniature cameras hidden within the picture frames. Every change blended seamlessly into the room's quiet mythology. Juliet was the first to visit on reopening night under the new owner. She said little, only murmured, "It suits you better this way," before slipping a list of names and descriptions of patrons who warranted attention into a new cocktail menu. Claire nodded, placed the list inside the safe beneath the counter, and locked it with her personal code. She knew she was no longer merely pouring drinks. Every order could be a thread in a web of alliances and betrayals she was slowly learning to read. Velvet Room was not just a bar. It was a crossroads where unlikely worlds brushed shoulders. Lawyers and criminals, artists and spies, politicians and information brokers. Claire learned to read the shift of an eye, to decode relationships by the distance between two glasses, to understand that the most valuable truths were often wrapped in silence. Near the end of her shift, when the last guest had left and the room settled into its soft afterglow, Julian walked in without announcement. He sat in his usual seat, the same one where their first encounter had unfolded. Claire set a glass of whiskey in front of him without asking, just as she had the very first time, but now she held his gaze instead of looking away. Julian lifted the glass, his eyes never leaving hers. "You did well. Velvet Room hasn't felt this alive in years." Claire smiled, not with pride but with a calm certainty. "It's my blood, my breath. I'm not turning it into a hiding place. It will be our network, our eyes in this city." Julian nodded, set the glass down, and rose without the theatrics of praise. He left a small leather-bound box on the counter. When Claire opened it, she found a simple silver ring engraved on the inside with faint Latin words, "In silentio potentia." In silence, there is power. She slipped it onto her finger, watching Julian walk out of Velvet Room, a place that was no longer just her workplace but a living extension of who she had become. A new chapter had begun, not with gunfire or blood, but with a nod, a look, and a silence that spoke volumes. That night, the cold settled over New Orleans in a strangely deliberate way, as though winter had forgotten to leave despite spring already taking root. Claire sat alone on the upper floor of Velvet Room, in the small corner where she could see the entire neighborhood blurred under the glow of old amber street lamps. The air carried the scent of aged wood, strong liquor, and time itself, yet to her, everything felt as though it were beginning again. The door opened softly, and Julian stepped inside in his dark suit, without bodyguards, without announcement. He took the seat across from her, resting his hand on the cool wooden table, his gaze steady and unflinching, as if he could always read the words she didn't say. Velvet Room was unusually quiet. No jazz, no crystal glasses chiming against each other, just the two of them, two worlds that had once existed apart, now sitting together in a silent understanding. Claire broke the silence first. "I still wonder if the things I have done were the right things." Julian didn't answer immediately. He reached into his jacket and placed a newspaper on the table. The front page carried the image of a seized yacht, the bold headline announcing the takedown of a federal human trafficking ring. He looked at her, his eyes no longer as cold as they once were. "You saved hundreds of lives without firing a single shot. For me, that is right." Claire nodded, though doubt still softened her gaze. Not because she longed for the life she once had, but because she understood that the road she had chosen would never allow her to turn back. Julian touched the rim of the glass in front of him, his voice low and steady. "People like us, Claire, we do not get the privilege of living simple lives, but we can choose how we use the power we have to build a different order. Not perfect, but perhaps a little more just." Claire didn't reply, yet she knew she had chosen correctly. Her life was no longer a string of repeating nights behind the bar, nor was it entirely the battlefield Julian once lived in. Between darkness and light, she chose to stand at the boundary, listening, observing, stepping forward only when the moment demanded it. Her presence had become a bridge between two worlds that were never meant to meet. Julian rose to his feet, but this time he didn't walk away immediately as he had before. He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "I don't need your loyalty, Claire. I need you exactly as you are. Someone who knows where the line is, but also knows when to cross it." She smiled, for the first time without hesitation in her eyes. "And I need you to keep your promise not to let anyone watch us ever again." There was no need for a handshake. They understood. From this point on, it was no longer debt, no longer protection, no longer dependence, but alliance. Each held half a secret, half a power, and together they created a balance neither could achieve alone. Claire watched Julian's figure disappear down the iron staircase, her heart unexpectedly light. She knew there would be more long nights ahead, more unseen challenges waiting in the shadows. But now, she was no longer alone, and that made all the difference. The story of Claire and Julian was never simply about those who moved in the dark, locked in conflict. It was a story about what it means to be human, caught between difficult choices, between the cost of silence and the strength of acting when the moment called for it. It reminded us that not everyone is born a hero, but anyone can become a force of change if they dare to stand up at the right time. Thank you for being here for today's story. If Claire's journey touched something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, give the video a like, and share it to help us bring more meaningful stories to the community. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever had to choose between safety and doing what is right? Leave a comment below and share your experience, so we can listen to the truths that come from deep within you. Every word you share is precious and helps us continue spreading human stories to more people. We'll see you in the next video. Wishing everyone watching this a strong, healthy life and peaceful days filled with happiness. Goodbye, and see you again soon.